I love working on my team because we not only get to do internal data work, but we also ship external user-facing data products. On my team, data science plays a really important role, and as data scientists, we have a high level of influence and ownership over our products. Today, I wanted to talk about the role that data plays in building merchant-facing data products, as well as how our data team has been able to collaborate effectively with different disciplines to influence our products. So as I mentioned, I work at Shopify. For those of you that haven't heard of Shopify, Shopify is a commerce platform that provides tools to start, grow, market, and manage a business of any size. We have millions of merchants around the world on the platform, including large, well-known brands like Allbirds, Gymshark, Heinz. But we also have merchants that are just starting out and using Shopify to launch their business. So I've spent most of my time at Shopify on the insights team. My team produces merchant-facing analytics and insights to ensure that merchants have the data they need to make data-informed decisions when running their business. Most of the data we surface is in the analytics section, which has a few different surfaces. We have the live view, which is a globe that shows a merchant real-time data around their visitors and sales around the world. We have the overview dashboard, which captures the health of a merchant's business and shows data around customers, sales, online store visits, and many other domains. We have notebooks, which we introduced last year, which allow merchants to have the flexibility to explore their data in a data story format. And we have reports, which allow merchants to dig deeper into their data. More recently, we started surfacing data beyond the analytics section. We started surfacing data where it is most relevant and impactful within a merchant's workflow. And we call these experiences in-context experiences. The goal of in-context experiences is to bring analytics closer to merchant workflows to help merchants make data-informed decisions as they're running their business. The first in-context experience we built was orders in context. And as part of that experience, we brought data around fulfillments and orders closer to where merchants were fulfilling their orders so that they had relevant data points as they were in their workflow. You're going to be hearing more about orders in context today because I'm going to be using it as an example product during my talk. So before getting into my talk, I wanted to share what I'll be covering over the next 45 minutes. I'm going to be talking about the central role that data science and data scientists play at every stage of building merchant-facing data products, from product ideation to launch. More specifically, I wanted to share how data science involvement helps produce better products, how we collaborate closely with other disciplines, what artifacts we use to facilitate collaboration, and the lessons we learned along the way. With that, I think we're ready to begin. So the first stage of building a new product is the product ideation phase, where we identify what we want to build. More specifically, when building an analytics product, we want to identify the merchant problem we're trying to solve and the requirements for what we want to build. By the end of this stage, we want to have a few different things. We want to have identified the metrics and the data we want to surface in their experience and the requirements. We want to figure out on what surface, out of the many analytic surfaces we have, we want to build on. And finally, we also want to have identified the audience for our product. So the first thing we do in this stage is we identify the merchant questions in the space. We want to make sure that introducing analytics to merchants is actually providing value to merchants. By identifying the questions merchants have in a domain, we're able to find metrics that we can use to answer these questions and provide value. For orders in context, one of the merchant questions we identified was, as a merchant, I want to know how long do different shipping carriers take to deliver my orders? After we've identified a list of questions, we identify the merchant goals and actions in this space. We want to ensure that the data we're surfacing addresses a certain goal and can also support a certain action. The key question we ask ourselves to come up with this goal is, what is a merchant trying to achieve within a product's domain? There are many ways to go about answering this question. We can talk to our product team and learn how they understand a merchant's goals, We can interview a sample of merchants and ask about their objectives, or we can put ourselves in the place of our merchants and think about what their top priorities would be. Following our orders in context example, by a merchant knowing how long different shipping carriers take to deliver orders, they are able to evaluate which shipping carriers provide the best shipping times. With this information, they can decide to work with shipping carriers with the shortest shipping times to offer the best experience to their customers. Once the questions, actions, and goals have been identified, we want to identify the metrics that we want to surface. Our metrics should support the intended action and merchant goal. We identify a list of metrics that can help support a merchant goal and metric dimensions that could help that could be used to view a certain metric. Following our orders in context example, the metric we could surface is the median shipping time by shipping carrier, which would ideally be able to view for different locations. Another metric we could surface is the distribution of shipping times for a carrier, which a merchant could use to get more detail than just the median value. Data science's involvement in this process of identifying merchant questions, goals, and metrics is important because as data scientists, we can validate that the proposed metrics make sense analytically. Through our involvement, we're also able to shorten the cycle in deciding what we want to surface. By partnering closely with our product team, requirements aren't handed to us, but rather we're coming up with them together. This makes the process of reaching a list of metrics we're aligned on faster. So once we have a list of metrics we want to surface, as data scientists, we want to figure out all the metric details by prototyping and analyzing what the data looks like for real merchants. With millions of merchants on our platform, we have a wide variety of merchants. So we want to ensure that we're exploring the data shape for different merchant segments. Doing this will not only help us validate the metrics, but it will also help us identify the details for each metric. There are three different parts to this. Firstly, we want to understand what form we should surface the data in. So should we be showing a top level number like a median value, or should we be showing a distribution? This will help us understand where we want to place a certain data point. So some formats are more appropriate for certain surfaces. For example, if the metric is most valuable with a certain complex viz, we may place it in a report instead of in context. Secondly, we want to see what time period the data would be most useful for. Would a merchant be able to make a decision with 1 day of data, or do they need 30 days or a longer time period to have an appropriate data point? In some cases, a merchant would need a certain amount of data for the data to be actionable. Thirdly, we want to understand what kind of data cleaning we need to do. The data quality in our source tables might not be great and might need some cleaning before showing a certain metric to a merchant. We want to explore this and identify any data cleaning that needs to be done. We also want to figure out the latency requirements for the data we're surfacing. We want to understand if we need to build a real-time streaming model or if having a certain latency and building in batch fulfills the merchant's needs. Streaming models take more time and effort to build given our infrastructure, so we want to make sure we understand if it is necessary to provide value or if there is value in our data, even if it has a certain latency. Looking at real data and prototyping is essential here because we may have some preconceived notions of what the data could look like, but seeing the reality of data for different merchant segments will help us validate the details of the metrics and the value of the experience. So when figuring out the details and requirements for metrics, data science's involvement is essential to ensure that the proposed metrics are realistic and sensible. As data scientists, we can also validate that the proposed metrics are valuable, and we can also start having an idea of what audience would find these metrics most useful. Through early prototypes and seeing what data we have available to us and seeing its quality, we're also able to have an early understanding of the effort it would take to build the experience on the data side, which means we can have good estimates around the timelines of the project even before going into the build stage. As part of this exploratory stage, we produce a lot of different analyses. typically all with a recommendation or a decision associated to them. For example, we'll produce an analysis that highlights that a certain metric would be most useful if shown for the last 30 days. Or by looking at the data, we think the model should be streaming real time because orders are frequent and we want the data to align with the orders coming in. To best communicate our findings and share recommendations, we've been creating data highlight slides. So data highlights are shareable slides that capture the main takeaways and recommendations from our analyses. On every data highlight, we make the title the most important data point from our analysis. We also add context around the data question we're trying to answer and any general context on why we're doing a certain exploration. We then attach a visualization or relevant data table and write takeaways and how to interpret the data. The most important part of the slide is the recommendation. We want to make sure that someone looking at the slide knows what to take from it. We typically have a specific audience in mind for the slide, for example, our product team. And with this audience in mind, we make sure that our recommendation is targeted. On the slide, we also include a link to a report with a more in-depth analysis if anyone wants to dig deeper into the data. We also make sure to include our contact details, so if someone beyond our team comes across the slide, they know who to reach out to for more details. These slides have been a really effective way for us to influence product decisions across our team, and also for us to have a record of all the analyses we've done over time. These slides are easily shareable, and even if you're not building analytics data products, using these slides may be really useful in sharing data points and stories with your team. Going back to the product ideation phase, now that we have the requirements and details around the metrics figured out, we want to identify the surface we're building on and the audience for the experience. This is not something that data needs to be involved in, but the decisions made will be better with data's involvement. For example, to identify the surface we want to build on, as data scientists, we're able to validate that merchant workflows happen in a specific space on the platform. By us looking into usage patterns, we're able to identify where the data could best live in context. For orders in context, it was an obvious decision that orders and fulfillments data points should be on the orders page, but that's not always the case. There may be different places where a merchant can perform a certain action. Looking into usage data to know where our data would be most impactful is essential to the success of our product. We also want to identify the audience for our experience. Through early prototyping, we already have a good idea of the target audience for our experience and what the metrics would look like for this segment. Having a good understanding of the segment and what the data would look like for them allows us to ship experiences to merchants that would find the most value from our product. Overall, data science's involvement to identify the surface and the audience for our experience ensures we're shipping analytics to the right place, to the right merchants. We look at what real data looks like for our target segment. By looking at what real data looks like for our target segment, we're also able to confirm that what the experience would look like and whether it's actually valuable to the merchant segment selected. With all the decisions made and the analyses that the data team does, we're able to have an early prototype for what our experience would look like for different merchant segments, even before moving into the build stage of our project. Through our involvement, we're also able to ensure that the decisions made along the way are validated and data informed. We're also able to de-risk the project and scope out the details of the work before going into building. Before wrapping up this stage of the project, we make sure we document everything in one central place for our whole team to have access to a source of truth of what we're building. We create an artifact, which we call the data specification sheet. This is a sheet which, in our case, has one row per metric and highlights all the key requirements and details around that metric. This is a living document and is a great way to ensure that there's one source of truth for all the details of the experience we're building. Before moving on to the next stage of the project, I wanted to reiterate 3 main takeaways. So firstly, central documentation is essential. The data specification sheet ensures that everyone is on the same page and that the requirements are transparent. The data highlights slide deck is a great way to keep track of all the analyses throughout a project, and it also ensures that we're sharing all our analyses with recommendations. This leads into the second takeaway, which is that pairing a recommendation with all our analyses has been an effective way to ensure that our voices as data scientists are heard and our analyses are informing product decisions. Without the recommendation, it can sometimes be difficult for stakeholders to know what to make of the data. So having a recommendation is an effective way to have analyses influence your product. The third takeaway is that we work and partner really closely with different disciplines, specifically UX and product in this stage. Meeting and sharing findings frequently and having open discussions around the recommendations has been really useful on our team. When we share a recommendation, we make sure we take the time to discuss it and also see if there are any follow-up questions or investigations we need to do. Ensuring that we partner with other disciplines and keep an open discussion is especially important to ensure we collaborate well across disciplines. So once we've completed the product ideation phase, we know what we want to build and we have all the details and requirements figured out. And at this point, we're ready to start building. When building a new merchant-facing analytics product, we want to ensure that we have the right data sets in place to surface data to merchants. The goal of this stage is to build and productionize data sets to surface the metrics we ideated. Given the analyses and the prototypes we've produced in the product ideation stage, we already have a good understanding of the data we have available to us. We also have some ideas for how we want to model our data sets to serve merchant-facing data. At this point, we take all our findings and come up with a data schema for the model or models that we want to surface data to merchants. There are 3 steps that we use to identify the data schema for our model. So first is we identify the business process our model should support. We want to build 1 model per business process. Secondly, we select the grain of our data. We typically pick the most atomic grain to give us flexibility in what data we want to surface. Thirdly, we identify the dimensions that we want to surface, so things like location. These will allow us to slice and dice the data to show merchants different views of their data. So with the data scheme in mind and the knowledge gathered from early investigations, we're able to build an initial model prototype. When creating data sets in our analytics experiences, there are 2 types of technical approaches for processing data we can take. The first is we can build a batch model where the job is scheduled and batches of data are processed together. These batch models are easier to develop given our infrastructure. However, these data sets have a latency associated to them, so they cannot be used to serve real-time insights. The other way we can process data is in a streaming environment. In this case, we would process data continuously. This approach allows our data to be real-time and fresh, but it is much more time-consuming to develop. In most cases, we start by building our model in batch because it's more straightforward and easy to iterate on, given our internal infrastructure. It also lets us figure out the logic of the job in an environment that's easier to develop in. Having an early prototype that can be used as a placeholder makes it so we can also unblock our developers building the experience. Unblocking the rest of our team for building and giving them an early version of the model makes our overall project timelines more condensed because we're able to work in parallel. We can iterate on the model and they can query a placeholder model to build the experience. Once we've iterated on the logic of the batch job and we've figured out the final logic for the job, we then work with data engineers to productionize our model and build it in a streaming environment so that we can serve real-time metrics and insights to merchants. Once we have this streaming version of the model, we can make the switch in the background for our developers to query newer models seamlessly. So there are a couple of takeaways from this stage I wanted to share. Firstly, building new models becomes a lot more straightforward through data science's involvement in the product ideation stage. Through our early involvement, we de-risk the building process because we figured out a lot of the details beforehand. We know the data we have available to us, and we already have the timelines in mind for development time. The second takeaway is that creating an early prototype, in our case, this would be an early batch model, will unblock developers building the experience and speeds up our project's timeline. This early prototype allows the team to have a model to query and use as a placeholder while we have more time to iterate and create more refined versions of the data model. So once we've built everything, we're still not ready to launch. We want to make sure we have a plan for how we can measure the success of what we're launching. This stage could happen in parallel to when you're building. The goal of this stage is to create a plan for how we want to measure the success of what we're launching. We not only want to have a plan in place, we also want to have an instrumented experience where events are emitted so that we can track different usage patterns. We also want to have dashboards and reports in place so that we can easily monitor usage and KPIs. On our team, we have a framework we use to come up with a measurement plan, and it's composed of a few different steps. When measuring product success, it can be tempting to jump immediately into hashing out metrics based on product goals. But it's better to start by zooming out and considering our merchants' goals, because our products succeed when they help our merchants succeed. These goals are the same as the ones that we've already identified in the product ideation phase. Again, the key question we ask ourselves to come up with them is, what is a merchant trying to achieve within the product's domain? For the orders and fulfillment space, the merchant goals can be to reduce shipping time or reduce shipping costs. The second step is to identify product goals. These are the goals of the product we're launching. The key question here is, how does the product aim to support the merchant in their goals? Determining the answer to this question is done in coordination with the product team, as they have the most context on what the product is intended to do. For orders in context, our goals were to make merchants data aware and data driven. So more specifically, merchants should be able to see their shipping times using our analytics and take actions like only use shipping carriers that are providing good shipping times to their customers. After having identified the merchant and product goals, we identify the questions we want to answer. Typically, these are questions that address adoption, engagement, retention, and impact of our product. These questions could be, so for adoption, are merchants discovering our product? For engagement and retention, are merchants continuing to use our product? And for impact, is this product making things better for merchants? We then come up with metrics to answer those questions. We want metrics to follow 5 different principles. So we want them to be simple. We want them to be precise. We want them to be feasible. So they need to be things that we can actually measure. They need to be sensitive. So they should be able to move, and they should be directional. So they should be able to tell us if what we launched was good or bad. For example, to measure whether merchants were adopting orders in context, we decided to look at the number of shops interacting with its main component, a navigation bar displaying key metrics at the top of the orders page. This metric is easy to explain and instrument. It clearly tells us how many merchants are actively noticing the experience. Also, it's directional. If this number is lower than expected, it tells us that the analytics bar is not sufficiently discoverable or interesting to merchants. In addition to success metrics, we also want to define tripwires or anti-success metrics. These are metrics that indicate when our product is actually making things worse and interfering with our merchants' goals. While our product's goal is to improve the merchant experience, it's good to have a concrete way of measuring any adverse impacts that we can observe and address any early issues. In the case of orders in context, our main tripwire metric was a change in the amount of time that merchants spend on their orders page. We didn't want our experience to interfere with a merchant's existing workflow. So any change in the time spent on this page would alert us of instances where this was happening. So once we've identified the metrics we want to be measuring, there are a few other details that we need to work out to finalize our measurement plan. We want to have a timeline for when we should measure a certain metric. Not every metric can be measured in the same time period. We typically have metrics that we measure in the short term, so 0 to 30 days, medium term, 30 to 60 days, or long term, 60 plus days. We also want to have baselines that we can use to compare whether our metrics are good or bad. We compute these baselines using usage of similar products we've launched. The final step is to map these metrics and their details back to the questions we've identified. We want to ensure that the metrics do really answer the overall questions we have around our product success. With our plan in place, we'll also want to ensure that we're emitting events and instrumenting the experience to be able to measure the metrics that we've identified in our measurement plan. Whether clicks, hovers, or views, we like to pair with our developers to instrument the experience together and to ensure that the events emitted are being emitted as expected. So as we wrap up this stage, I wanted to reiterate a few different takeaways. Firstly, working with our product team to come up with a measurement plan ensures that the plan we have is realistic and feasible, but is also covering the product goals. This collaboration here is really important. Secondly, having data-informed baselines when possible is essential to being able to determine whether the usage patterns we're seeing for the metrics are good or bad. Thirdly, metrics in isolation are not informative. There's not just one metric that can determine the success of our full experience. We need to have metrics that capture different elements and are tracked over different time periods to truly be able to determine how our merchants are interacting with the experience. Another takeaway is that our metrics might behave differently for different types of end users. So having identified different segments of merchants we want to explore is essential to getting a holistic view of our product success. For example, at Shopify, we may segment our merchants by plan type or order volume or sales band. Another takeaway is that metrics typically can't all be measured within the same time period. So identifying short, medium, and long-term metrics you want to track is important. Some metrics require months of data before they'll see potential movement, while others you'll see movement right away. Dividing up our measurement plan with metrics to monitor in the short, medium, and long term in turn ensures that we're measuring the right things at the right time and also gives our team a clear agenda of the post-launch analysis work. Finally, building dashboards before launching will make launch a lot smoother, but also doing a lot of dashboard work before launch ensures that we find any bugs in instrumentation before launch. So we're now at the final stage of the product development process. We've ideated a product, we've built it, and we know how to measure success. So now we can finally launch. The goal of this stage is not only to launch, but also to measure the impact of what we've shipped and even be able to iterate over our product with the learnings gathered. Launch day is an exciting day. It's the day we're able to see the product we've been developing in the hands of our merchants. On this day, it's important to have dashboards in place to monitor usage. We want to make sure that there's a way to see early signs of life for our product. At the end of launch day, our data team shares data highlights around the usage for the day and some initial numbers. This is a great way to wrap up the day. None of this data will be conclusive, so you won't be able to determine the success of your product this early, but it is exciting to see some early numbers around usage. Post-launch, the data work continues. This is when we get to actually explore what we listed in the measurement plan and also explore other things that we may be curious to explore. We share data highlights consistently for our team to stay engaged with the product even after launching. Another thing we do is we set up interactive self-serve dashboards where our own team can explore the usage of the experience and different usage metrics for different user segments. Giving our team the flexibility to explore the data themselves has increased our team's engagement with data and has even highlighted some data points or patterns that we hadn't thought of. So there are a few takeaways I wanted to mention for this stage. Firstly, when launching, having instrumentation in place is essential to have an understanding of how users are engaging with the experience. There may be anecdotes around how specific users are finding the experience, but having data tells a story for a wider range of users. Secondly, after launch, our work as data scientists is not done. It's important for us to follow through with our measurement plan, but also do analyses that can help inform how we iterate over the experience and improve it in following versions. The last takeaway is that sharing data highlights consistently after launch engages your team with the data and also highlights the importance of instrumentation. Over time, our team has felt more motivated to instrument our experiences, given that they've seen the value in the form of interesting highlights or data insights that we're sharing with them. So that was the full product development cycle for analytics products at Shopify. We went through the product ideation stage where we figure out what we want to build. We went through the build process where we prototype and eventually productionize merchant-facing data models. We went through the creation of a measurement plan where we identify how we would measure the success of what we're building. And we went through the launch stage where we make our product available to merchants and we measure whether it was successful and use our analyses to inform future versions of our product. I share takeaways for every stage, but I wanted to leave you with a few overall takeaways. Firstly, I've mentioned this a lot, but having recommendations linked to your analyses is essential to having data science influence decisions. Sharing data points without the recommendation makes it hard for stakeholders to know what to make of the data. Secondly, data science is central to every stage of the product lifecycle. Lots of decisions could be made without data, but having data science's involvement makes it so decisions are validated and the details are realistic. The last takeaway is that while data science is important, we need to make sure we're partnering and collaborating closely with different disciplines to be the most effective. The work we do is really closely tied to different disciplines, and we need to build strong relationships with our team to be able to ship the best products. So I shared a lot about our team and the work that we do, and if any of this sounds interesting to you, we are hiring data scientists and data engineers around the world. So feel free to take a look at our careers page or reach out to me directly. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for your presentation, Federica. And yeah, I really think that was a great way to start off the with the theme of our conference, data science and production swimming in the ocean. Seeing how you create a product from start to finish, and so with that, I'm going to start in going through the Q&A. So, and also, just let me know if any of these questions are too specific to something at Shopify. So the first highest upvoted question is, what are the proportion of time you divide between different steps? So the 4 steps you mentioned: product ideation, building, measure, success, launching.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think it really depends on the project. So product ideation, product ideation I think takes a long, can you hear me? Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, yeah. Maybe I won't share this Q&A thing. Yeah,
product ideation, I think, takes a long time if we're not particularly familiar with a domain. So as an insights team, we produce insights a lot of different domains. So if we're jumping into a new domain, it may take us a significant amount of time to speak to actual domain experts and ramp up on the knowledge to be able to ideate the product. So I'd say that's probably the stage that typically takes the most, given that we are jumping into new domains all the time. And having a solid foundation makes building a lot more straightforward. I think building can take a quite a short amount of time if you have all the requirements and everything prototyped and figured out. And then again, like something like the measurement plan is something that we do for all our projects. So it's something that comes really automatic to us. Also given the amount of work we do in product ideation. So I'd say product ideation is probably like the most significant part of the project, but its length varies on how comfortable we are in a certain domain.
Right. Okay, that totally makes sense. Then moving on to the next question, how does your team prioritize which merchant question to work on?
That's a really good question. So typically so again, we're not domain experts a lot of the time, so we speak to the actual domain team. So there is an actual orders team or an inventory team at Shopify, and they help us prioritize the questions based off actual conversations they've had with merchants, because typically there is a prioritized list of what a merchant needs from our product offering. So speaking to them gives us a really good way to prioritize.
Right. So they kind of give you a recommendation and then you guys go from there, basing it on data. Okay.
Exactly.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Thanks.
And it also depends, maybe one other thing, it also depends on like what merchant goals or actions are actually like doable within the platform. Like some merchant questions or actions may not actually be supported yet, or might be like too far removed for us to address with data. So while they're merchant questions or goals in a certain domain, only some of them can actually be addressed with data. So that's also a way that we can like weed out maybe questions that we can't address currently with data.
Right. Or like, is there ever a time where you're thinking is it usually like there's a bunch of merchant questions and you just have to prioritize which one is like you can start working on first, or the low-hanging fruit as well? Or is it usually like as it comes, you guys just start working on it?
No, so we definitely have like a long list of questions when we start this project. We'll typically have like brainstorming sessions internal to our team, and then also with like our actual domain team, so like the orders team. And with this long list, then we go through the list and we prioritize it with them based on like the merchant priorities, but also what is feasible.
Okay, thanks. Then, okay, the next question is, how do we differentiate between merchant goals and product goals in the step 3? This person felt like they seem a bit overlapping.
Yeah, they definitely do have overlap. So a merchant goal is independent of the product we're shipping. Like, what is it that a merchant wants to do in a space? So for orders, they want to decrease their shipping time or their shipping costs. The product goals is really specific to what we can offer in analytics. So how do we address that merchant goal with the product that we're shipping? So there's definitely overlap. Like our product goals are informed by the merchant goal because we want the merchant to be able to achieve their goal through what we offer.
Right. Okay. So I guess it's like the merchant goal informs the product goal.
Exactly.
Okay.
Like as our product will not achieve its goals if we're not making our merchants satisfied with achieving their goal.
Okay. Okay. The next question, it might be too specific, but can you give an example? You mentioned features you notice making the merchant experience worse. Do you have an example of that, or can you share an example of that?
Yeah. So I don't know if we've actually shipped anything, at least in my time at Shopify in the last 4 years, that made the experience worse. But one of the tripwires I mentioned or anti-success metrics is just merchants spending more time in a certain space than they should with our analytics. So the goal of our in-context experiences was not to distract the merchant from their workflow when they were in context. It was just to inform them and to lead them to reports if they wanted to explore the data further. So one of the anti-success metrics that we definitely monitored was them spending way more time on their orders page. And that would give us an indication of us distracting from their primary goal, because we didn't want data to be like the primary thing that they were necessarily looking at on the page. We just wanted it to support their actions. Luckily, like with our launch of orders in context, we didn't see that happening. But there are definitely a lot of different things that we track to make sure that we're not actually making the merchant experience worse.
Right. So it would be something like maybe could it even be related to the actual product you created itself? Like, is it maybe also could be a UI thing, like maybe the graph is taking up too much space? Is that something you also your team would be monitoring?
Yeah, totally. And I think that's where we complement like the quantitative data that we actually track works really well with the qualitative data that we get through merchants through either support calls or merchants sending in their merchant frustrations, we call them. So that's definitely something we track when we're launching our experience. So we make sure that we're not getting like messages saying like, this is taking up too much space.
Right.
So yeah, definitely like we look at more quantitative feedback, but we also do collect qualitative feedback from support.
So, okay. Oh yeah, like someone said in the chat, is that so like you look at the number of complaints from the merchant or just any? Okay.
Yeah, every merchant frustration that we get in, we do have like a tag around what product it's associated to. So we do know, even in terms of numbers, what like an acceptable number is for an experience.
The next question is, how do you come up with recommendations from the analysis? Is it based on previous action or made on intuition?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's a little bit of both. I think sometimes the data story is so clear. So as an example, for orders in context, we shipped the bar of analytics, and we were trying to decide the default time period for the metric. So should we be showing like 30 days of data as the primary number, or should we be showing just 1 day of data? And so we explored how much data actually how many orders merchants were getting on days for different merchant segments. And we saw that there were clear segments of like lower volume merchants, maybe medium and large volume merchants. And so that division made it really clear that there wasn't like just one default time period that we could have, but we needed 3 default time periods. So that in that case, like the data story really told itself. So it is based off intuition, definitely. But I'd say like as data scientists, I think on our team specifically, we play the product manager. We're very like product oriented as well. So we do, I think in our analyses, sometimes see data stories that like make it really clear what the recommendation would be. That's not always the case, but I think a lot of the times it is.
Right. So it's kind of, excuse me, in that case, it seems like a bit of both, like, that, yeah, there's like smaller merchants and big merchants, but also it's so obvious that.
Yeah, but also it's the kind of thing that like, where the data story maybe is unclear, we'll have a recommendation, like none of our recommendations we have 100% certainty on. So it's the kind of thing that we experiment, we monitor, and then we get feedback on, and then maybe we'll iterate over. And it's also the kind of thing where like our collaboration with product is so important here, because some of our recommendations, maybe our product managers will not agree with. So us going back and forth and maybe coming up with like other data points that could either prove or disprove a recommendation is important. So it's definitely like an open discussion.
Okay. Moving to the next question. If you have a new feature or / product that has not existed within the company, how do you establish the baseline, I guess, when adding the new feature?
Yeah, that's something definitely that like we thought about a lot when we launched our first in context experiences. We didn't have like an idea of like what we could expect the usage to be. With that, we did have like a target audience in mind. So we knew the users that we had in mind. coming up with like a baseline that you're really certain in is really hard in these cases, but you can still have an audience and with your first launch, create that baseline for future launches. So it won't be like a perfect baseline, but it will give you a general idea of maybe what you could hope to happen. In our case, like we have been shipping analytics products for many, many years. So just with the audience, even though we'd never shipped in context experiences, we had a general idea of like what we could hope from the experience, but we didn't necessarily use that as like a hard rule for whether like our experience was performing well or poorly, because we kind of needed to calibrate our baseline for in context after launch.
Okay, so thanks. Okay, and then just a reminder to everyone, you can keep asking questions on Menti. It's still open and upvoting them. So the next question is, you talked a lot about collaborating with other disciplines during the product ideation phase. Can you talk about a time when you encountered a challenge during this process? Or again, maybe it's too specific.
Yeah, a challenge around collaboration.
Yeah, with other disciplines.
Yeah. So I'd say I can't think maybe of a specific example, but I can say that like when data started being involved more and more in our product teams, it wasn't like our working structure wasn't as smooth as it is now. So I'd say it definitely takes time for data to be valued, like and have a seat at the table. So I think making sure that we're showing that our analyses are actually creating recommendations that are useful on the product side, for our collaboration with UX, ensuring that like, or showing them that like we can look at what real data looks like for merchants, so we can propose what a certain visualization should be for a certain metric, like that shows our value. And even with engineering, like showing that like we can help with instrumentation, and this is like with instrumentation we can like measure the success of our product. Like I think like us being able to collaborate with every discipline and show the value of data over time will definitely make it like has made it easier over time for us to be valued like members of the team.
Yeah, that's cool, because yeah, that's always like I'm always so interested in that like interdisciplinary collaboration, because yeah, everyone always thinks their discipline or their thing is the most important. It makes the most sense, and why can't everyone else see why, like for in my case, like the data is so and analytics is so important. So yeah, I'm just always interested in hearing about that. Okay, then I think maybe we're on like the last one or two questions. So everyone just now is your last chance to get in your question before we start to wrap up. So this question says, thank you for your talks. It's really useful and I love the key takeaways. One question I have is that how do you foresee the how do you foresee the issue before launch day? Do you have a pre-launch test?
Yeah. So I guess maybe it's around the preparation we do pre-launch to see what any issues are. So there's a few things we do to check. So in terms of what I mentioned around instrumentation, we can see like test events that happen. So that allows us to check for any bugs in instrumentation. Another thing we do to prepare for launch is a lot of times we're creating new data models, which are going to be queried by millions of merchants, which is like a pretty intense load on our analytics platform. So we definitely do load testing. We work really closely with our data engineers to come up with estimates for how many queries will be run, how many people will be running them, just so that we're prepared and our infrastructure can also scale up to that when we are launching, and there are no bad surprises.
Okay. Then the next question is, how do you create merchant segments? Is it based on the product type or the user type?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it definitely depends on the product we're launching. So when we're launching orders related metrics, like we'll probably be using segments based off orders or sales, because that will define the difference that merchants will see in their data. But if we're working maybe around like inventory data, we'll be segmenting based off like the percentage of products that a merchant like tracks their inventory for. So I think the product that we're in and the analytics we're surfacing definitely help us define our merchant segments. And then there are some basic ones that we always use, like plan level. Like there's different plans that you can have at Shopify, some with more advanced analytics offerings, or some with just more features. And that's something that we always use. Or things even like country are sometimes valuable. Like for orders data, for example, like North American merchants definitely have better quality data around deliveries or around fulfillments than maybe like merchants in other countries. So that's also something we keep in mind, and we kind of adapt segments and explore a bunch of different segments to see what makes sense in a specific case.
Then the next question is, sometimes the product/business teams share their goals in a more qualitative and general sense. Do you have any tips to transform those goals into more specific questions?
Yeah, I think a lot of this, I think when we first started being really involved in creating and created this framework for our measurement, it was definitely, we were in a similar situation where maybe we had more like qualitative type goals. I think us being able to come up with like a proposal for maybe what the exact questions are and doing like a lot of the legwork, I guess, to make our team see what an alternate world to maybe more qualitative questions could be, was useful to moving into that direction. So I think adopting like a framework and actually us proposing what we should be doing was useful.
Okay, and then thank you so much for answering all these questions. I'm just going to like read the one last question, and then for everyone, we're going to take a break. So the last question is, what visualizations tool do you use? And also, can you speak more on your internal infrastructure?
Yeah, so for visualization, we use Mode Analytics or Tableau, or we sometimes will even just use Jupyter notebooks to just like show what visualizations would look like potentially for merchants, like for prototyping. For in terms of like visualizations we ship to merchants, we actually have our own library to show visualizations, and it's called Polaris Viz. In terms of internal infrastructure, we have our own internal analytics system. We have a few articles about it in our blog. But basically, we can model, as I mentioned, in batch or in streaming to process data, or we can use like a Lambda kind of approach where we do a backfill using batch and use streaming to like top up and serve real-time insights. But it is like an internally developed tool.
Okay, so with that, like, thank you again for your presentation, and yeah, taking the time out of your day to day to give this presentation, and then also, yeah, preparing it. We really appreciate it. And I'm not sure, are you going to, if you're going to be staying around for the rest of the conference, like please do and join us on next Friday. But in the meantime, we're going to take a break and we'll be back at 10:40 with another talk. So in the meantime, like everyone, I guess we'll send a reminder message at like 2 minutes before, but in the meantime, we'll open the breakout rooms for you guys to network with one another. But if not, we'll see you again at 10:40. Thanks.